Hey everybody, it's ShadowStar, here for my review of Doctor Who, Classic Who, The Keys of Marinus. So, yes, I've decided to go through and review every single classic story. Okay, sorry, not every single classic story. I'm going to review a lot of classic stories, since I have a lot of classic stories on DVDs, some of which I haven't seen in a very long time, so I figured, well, why not let's start reviewing them one by one, week by week. Starting with The Keys of Marinus. No, we're not starting from the very beginning. I'm just going to kind of go with a bunch of random stories. But anyway, let's get on to this story. So, honestly, I haven't seen this story in a very long time, but it still felt... But honestly, this first part, I was actually quite enjoying. It's got a decent amount of pace, a little bit of mystery. I like the way Classic Who does this. I like the fact that Classic Who does that thing where they step out and they just explore the planet. I feel like that doesn't happen enough in modern Who. Oftentimes, in modern Doctor Who, the Doctor will go somewhere, and usually the Doctor already knows where they're going, and it's just the companion who might not know. There's a few modern stories where they don't know where they're going, but usually they have a rough idea and they can figure things out too quickly. I like the fact that the Doctor doesn't know, they kind of just push the random button, see where it goes, and then, the Doctor can be just as intrigued, which is great. It also kind of helps show that this is the early days for the Doctor, both in the show and for the character itself. This is early days, so it makes sense they're much more inquisitive and wanting to explore just like anyone else. So I really enjoy that pacing to it. So far, all the characters are fine. Yes, Susan screams a lot, but I feel like nothing too egregious, especially since she usually screams when no one's around, so at least I think in that regard it makes sense. If you were just grabbed, you would scream, especially if nobody's around. You want to scream so to alert other people, so I'm like, we'll see if Susan gets annoying, but so far so good. But yeah, it starts off, it's this planet, things are a bit odd because the water's made of acid and there's glass on the beach, so you've got all that kind of stuff. Then you see some creatures or aliens or whatever they are traipsing around, you're thinking, are they the villains? But then we finally, after we explore the building a bit, sure it's a bit slow pacing, but we explore the building a bit, and we finally meet some elder guy called Arbiten, and he kind of explains the deal of this planet Marinus, how, and this is the thing I find interesting, they supposedly invented a machine that can determine right from wrong, so this machine can determine absolute morality, and the machine kind of overrides it, so now people on this planet don't know what evil is, and they don't have evil thoughts or intentions. I find this to be an interesting thing that the Doctor is so okay with this. I feel like, let's say this machine and this planet and these people existed and it was a modern story, like the 10th Doctor or the 12th Doctor, I feel like they'd delve more into the grey morality of you can't determine what morality is and a machine shouldn't have that much power. But they at least delve into that somewhat by saying the machine can now be controlled, so if these alien Vords were to get a hold of the machine, they could change people's free will on the planet, which is why we have to go on this fetch quest. It's almost like a video game. We're going on this fetch quest to find 5 or 6 keys of Marinus? 6 would make sense, there's 6 parts. But yeah, I find it interesting. But I do like that. At first I was thinking, oh, it's a bit odd, they're just so happy to help. But then, no, they do lock off the TARDIS. They can't get away, and it's like, well, we got to help you, and then I'll give you your TARDIS back. So that basically sets up the first part. So yeah, so far, first part's pretty good. Part 2 turned out to be quite the mini-adventure on our little key quest before it got started. So everyone teleports in. It seems like Barbara's been kidnapped, but no, she's just hiding in this room. And we arrive in this luxurious room where everything's perfect. We got food, everyone's going to give us stuff. But immediately, the Doctor, or more specifically Ian, is quick to be skeptical about it. But eventually they settle down and apparently they can be given everything they want. Then obviously at night time we see things are more suspicious when at night they place this mind control device on all of them, although for some reason it just falls off of Barbara because they don't glue it onto their heads for some stupid reason. So yeah, but that means when we wake up we've got this cool idea where the room is actually apparently filthy and trashy, and only Barbara can see it, and they're all seeing an illusion. And that comes in clever because the Doctor asks for a fancy laboratory, but really it's just rubbish. So really, he thinks it's great, but the audience only sees the rubbish. That way they don't have to actually show a fancy laboratory. So yeah, that was clever. And then it turns out this whole this whole part 2 kind of feels like a mini adventure, because, we start off mind controlled. We see Barbara on her own. She finds the daughter of Arbitan from the previous episode. And then we find out we're being controlled by brains, and this whole city's controlled by brains in the jars. And then I guess Barbara just smashes everything, and then everything's solved, and then we're off to go get the keys. So yeah, it was an interesting mini adventure in this little 6-part story, and yeah, like I said, you could argue it's filler, because you could cut out that part, and really they're just off to go look for keys, which is what they were supposed to do at the end of part 1 anyway. But now they're off to get keys, but they're going to split up, which I believe means that in the next episode, the Doctor won't be present, because that is something they did in the first and second Doctor eras, is sometimes characters are just quietly missing for one part of a story, because the show ran year-round, so that was the idea. That's how they give an actor a week off, is just let the character not be around for an episode. So yeah, now we're actually going to go find keys. Apparently we already have one. Did the brains in the jars have a key? I think there's 5 keys. Then they said, because Arbitan already had a key, so that leaves 4. Now they said there's 3 missing, because they've already got one. So is that one Arbitan had and there's 4? Or is that the one the brains in the jars had? Did the brains in the jars have a key? I'm not sure. Where did he get this key? Anyway, whatever. They're going on an adventure. They found Arbitan's daughter. Oh yeah, Arbitan got murdered in the end of part 1 as well. And then they also brought this other guy who was showing them around before he got mind controlled. Also, off in the background, they apparently started a revolution, because when the brains in the jars are destroyed, everybody, apparently the whole city is mind controlled, so I guess now they're starting a revolution, but that's a nice little detail. I like that. See, that feels like something the Doctor would do, starting a revolution after people have been mind controlled. But we got to move on from that, because that's just one part of the story. But yeah, I believe the Doctor will be missing in action for this next part of the story, because, oh boy, Susan's going to scream and panic because there's a jungle and it's noisy, and I don't know, people scream for no reason in this show. But I like this part 2. You could argue it's filler to this 6-part story, because they're still trying to work out the pacing, but it was a nice idea nonetheless. Okay, so part 3 was definitely the least exciting so far out of the first 3 parts. It was alright. It was definitely more of a Ian and Barbara little adventure as they explore this jungle, try to find the key. We think we found the key. Turns out it's fake. There's all these traps and stuff. And then Susan and the other 2 just go ahead without them because Barbara gets trapped. Then they find this old guy. Then he just dies. He gives them some code. At first they think it's a code for a safe. Then it turns out it's actually just a formula. I will say this. I am severely disappointed that the code DE302 does not stand for anything. I looked at that periodic table. It doesn't mean anything. O2 would mean oxygen, but DE is not anything on the periodic table. Come on. If this were a more recent episode, or if it were a different show, they definitely would have made that some sort of Easter egg. But no, it's not a real formula that the key was hidden in. But yeah, Ian and Barbara just wander around. There's these traps. It turns out there's this time distortion thing, which is... I like the explanation that it's not just, oh, evil vines. There's time distortion causing extremely fast overgrowth, which is why the vines come in. Why it happens at night, I don't know. Why that guy died, I don't know. But whatever, they wander around, there's some traps, then they finally teleport, and if I'm correct, they're teleporting to the same place that Susan and the others would have went to, but obviously they would have went ahead, so now they're in some snowy place, and yeah, this third part, I don't know, was a bit slow. If you like Ian and Barbara scenes, this would be a nice little part of the story. But if you're not that into the Ian Barbara scenes, then it's not as exciting. Obviously, as I said, the Doctor isn't present in this particular part of the story because the actor went on holiday. I don't know if he's present in part 4. We'll find out in a minute. But yeah, it's alright. Hopefully the story picks up pace again in a minute. We're halfway through the story now. So part 4. It's a lot like part 3, but this time there's snow instead of a jungle. And a really disturbing man in the mountains. First you think he's saving everybody, then he tries to trap people to their death, then he possibly wants to do disturbing things to Barbara? It's never quite implied why he wants to keep her, but don't let your imagination run wild with that one, because, that was a bit creepy. But, yeah, I don't know, there's this mountain man, he's trapping people, blah, blah, blah. And then, I don't know, I found Ian very enjoyable in this part of the story. He gets really sadistic, and he's always protective of Barbara and Susan and all that, but, like, obviously, without the Doctor around, Ian's really take charge. Ian gets really pissed off when the guy is going to possibly do bad things and traps people to their death. Then he gets trapped on the other side. Then Ian possibly kills somebody because it's a bit ambiguous. I'm not talking about the cliffhanger. I'm talking about they find a key in the snow part, and there's these soldiers, but it's a little unclear whether these are people or whether they are kind of sort of like, I don't know, I wouldn't say robots, but sort of like a defense mechanism for the key. If they're just a defense mechanism for the key, then you don't feel too bad about Ian making one fall to their death. But if it is a person who was somehow brought back, then Ian just blatantly killed somebody. And then we have a cliffhanger where Ian didn't kill somebody, but he was framed for murder, and then we end up in this place, and then the key is locked somewhere, and then some mysterious figure steals the key and frames Ian and puts a murder weapon in his hand, so yeah, I do vaguely remember what's going to happen in the last 2 parts, which is good because the Doctor will be back. But once again, yeah, part 4 was alright, no Doctor. But yeah, just a lot of wandering around the snow. But I really liked Ian and taking charge in this scene. But otherwise, it's less like, yeah, the pacing can pick up a bit. It's like, that is the one thing about this story, The Keys of Marinus, is every single part, this is kind of a good and bad thing. On one hand, every part of the story is distinct. Part 1, we're on the beach in the temple. Part 2, we're in that place with the brain slugs. Part 3, we're in the jungle. Part 4, we're in the snow. But on the other hand, you could say, well, we're just jumping around a lot, whereas later classic stories definitely feel like just one big story cut into chunks, which is definitely how I prefer it, rather than having to individually go piece by piece, where it feels like this really does feel like you're watching a 6-part thing rather than watching one big story just cut into pieces. But yeah, whatever. Anyway, 2 parts left to go, and I believe we're going to get a completely random court scene in the middle of our episode, so yeah, at least the Doctor will be back in the next 2 parts. Okay, so part 5 was definitely much more engaging than parts 3 and 4. You know why? Because the Doctor's back. And honestly, I was really enjoying this part, mainly because obviously William Hartnell just has such a brilliant charm to him. That part where he's in the room and he's explaining the possible ways the murder could have happened to Barbara and Susan, and he's just got these mannerisms around him that the way he points, the way he speaks, reminds me a little bit about when Capaldi is certain about something. So I really enjoyed that scene. Obviously, yes, once again, I will point out that this story is all over the place. Suddenly we're, on our fetch quest to the Keys, we've had a violent man in the snow, a rabid jungle, and now a court scene. Don't get me wrong, I'm actually enjoying it. It's actually quite an interesting court scene, to be honest, for a random episode of Doctor Who, so I'm enjoying that, but when you think about the fact that this is all one story, and most people these days watch the stories in one chunk, you realise, oh boy, it's just a mess. But this part of the story is at least interesting, and still continues on, because you've got the cliffhanger of now Susan's been kidnapped again, and now they're threatening her if they don't say anything at the trial, and so on. But I did like the little clever bit when what's her name produced one of the other keys, because remember, we were told the keys are all identical. That was a part in part 3, and now we're able to use that because we've got the other keys, so we produce a different key, and they don't know the difference, and that got the other guy to react, which surely should be enough evidence that something is up. But hey, at least that was a clever moment. I saw that coming. I saw that. It's like, oh, that's clever, that's clever. So that was nice. This does bring up an interesting point. They say murder is rare, which makes sense when you remember this machine that we're getting the keys for keeps everyone nice and calm. But that raises an interesting question. Why have we had violent people like that man in the mountains and so on in a world where apparently this machine in Marinus is apparently controlling people and deciding the morals of what's right and wrong? So I'm confused. How can there be any murder? How can we have this disturbing man from the snow place if this machine... I thought the machine affected the whole planet. That's what we're getting the keys for. This whole plot is because the Vords are apparently getting close to the machine, so I guess we're going to see. There's one part left. Let's wrap up the story. We've got to clear Ian's name because this court system works in reverse where the evidence is on the innocent. You have to, as opposed to in real life, the innocent, the burden of proof is on the guilt. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, not the defense. But anyway, it's an interesting little twist to make things interesting. So you know what? I like that though. I like that since we're on an alien world, we can actually do that way of going backwards, and it makes sense. But yeah, so let's see how that last part wraps up. And so we finish off this story, the 6th part. Like I said, I do think certain bits dragged on at times, but I enjoyed the legal proceedings in parts 5 and 6. Turns out the wife did it. And there was this nice little scene between the prosecution lawyer and the doctor. I like that that he was being friendly at the end, because it just shows lawyers are lawyers and they don't have any ill will against other lawyers. They're just doing their job. I like that little moment. And I like all the good foreshadowing too. I like the fact that, we get back there and once again we use the keys as a good plot device. We just at first think, oh, Ian's given a key, but once again I managed to predict and go, of course, it's the fake key from the previous episode in the jungle. So it all ties out in the end and they destroy it. And I like the fact that the doctor discussed what I was saying. The doctor doesn't truly approve of this machine that decides morals. So I like that he said, well, we can still carry on the work with them being in charge. Presumably they'll go on and carry on the work without a machine, because the machine blew up. The Vord, I guess, died. And all in all, that was a good wrap-up. So, part 6 was a good wrap-up. We freed Susan, we freed Ian, it all wrapped up pretty well. And like I said, the only reason I feel like parts 3 and 4 dragged on is because the doctor wasn't there. Especially parts 4. I feel like you could have skipped part 4 entirely. Like, I really wish they'd just cut out part 4 and have them go straight maybe from the jungle to the court scene, because I feel like part 4 was the most fillery, and maybe trimmed out some of the stuff in part 3, but overall I think it was all a good story. I don't think it dragged on too much. Like I said, I'm on the firm belief that most classic stories should not exceed 4 parts, because 4 parts is basically the equivalent of a 2-parter in modern Doctor Who anyway, so, I feel like 6 parts is pushing it. Like I said, there was some room where you could trim the fat beyond just your standard classic Who slower storytelling. I feel like there are some parts where you're like, we're wasting our time, but I suppose filler was a necessary evil back in the day because they needed the time to give the actors time off because they film year-round. Don't worry, they fix that eventually, but all in all, there was an alright one for this to be my first classic Who review. Obviously, I've seen some classic stories before, and I think I'd seen this one before too. But yeah, I've seen a handful of classics, but there's many classics I haven't seen at all and I have on DVD. For those wondering, the next classic story I plan on watching will be The Aztecs, which I believe is actually the next one chronologically anyway. So yeah, I'm enjoying these classic reviews and I plan on doing one every week. So I enjoyed this classic story. I'm not really going to give definitive rankings of them because it's hard to rank each story. There's not much to compare it to, but overall, this was definitely one I enjoyed more. I don't know if it's one. I mean, it'll be interesting to compare it to once I've seen more of the classic stories. Like, okay, off the top of my head, like Remembrance of the Daleks and Genesis of the Daleks and the Three Doctors and the Five Doctors are all good classic stories, but we'll see how these ones go. I feel like the first and second Doctor era, it can be a bit tougher to get to. They're slowest in terms of pacing. Obviously, Black and White, it's a whole rigmarole, and especially when we get into missing stories, but we'll worry about that for another time. Anyway, I enjoyed the Keys of Marinus, although I feel like they could have trimmed the fat. That's all I can really say. I enjoyed it, the Doctor was really fun in it. I feel like Ian had a lot of good protective moments, Susan didn't get on my nerves, and overall the Doctor is always so fun and charming when he's explaining things and being curious at the beginning, and it all wraps up in the end, and I like that you can predict the little twists when they subvert things with the different keys. I'd be interested to see who saw that coming and who didn't. So, it's a nice little twist that's not a crazy plot twist, but still, not saying it's super well hidden, but it's a nice thing that you might see coming or you might not. So I like that. Anyway, I will see you next week for more Classic Who reviews, Doctor Who reviews, and other things as well. See you next time, guys.